Well, welcome to you. Really good to see everybody on the call, and thank you for joining us for an early webinar. We're normally here at sort of 6 p.m. So again, it's really good to see so many people. We're going to be talking about poetry, literature, and the Catholic imagination. And this webinar is presented in partnership with the University of Notre Dame, Australia. I'm Amanda Davison-Young. I'm the CEO of the Tablet, and I'm delighted to introduce Professor Renee Kohler-Ryan, Associate Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Academic, University of Notre Dame, Australia. Good to see you, Renee.
Lovely to see you, Amanda, and welcome everyone. I'm really excited about this conversation because I think it's just going to be a lot of fun, but also just so full of rich, not only information, but sort of it's just a really rich discussion area. So really pleased to be here. Thank you, Amanda. I just want to quickly introduce our panelists tonight, and then we're going to jump right into it. So first of all, on my screen, I have Elizabeth Powell. So Elizabeth teaches courses in ecology and poetry and in theology and the visual arts for the University of Notre Dame in London. Her book, David Jones and the Craft of Theology, explores questions of theological genre and method by way of a close engagement with selected artworks by this 20th century artist and poet. So welcome, Elizabeth, and we're looking forward very much to hearing your expertise on David Jones. And then Gary Wade. So Gary holds an adjunct position at my university, at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, through the Sydney campus in the School of Philosophy and Theology. And he is the author of Seamus, Heaney and Catholicism, published by Cambridge University Press this year in 2025. And keep an eye out because at some point we're going to have an online launch of the book, which I'm really looking forward to. He is also the author of Seamus Heaney, one of 48 chapters in the forthcoming Cambridge History of Irish Poetry, so that will be coming out next year, and is currently working on the Cambridge Introduction to Seamus Heaney, which is under contract with Cambridge University Press for 2027. And he is a contributor to Volume 9 of the forthcoming The Oxford History of Poetry in English. So we're in for a treat because we'll get some Heaney tonight. Thanks very much, Gary.
Thank you,
And
Rennie.
finally, Anne-Marie Blanchard, also a colleague at Notre Dame, but on the other campus of our university, is a multidisciplinary educator who lectures in philosophy with a focus on aesthetics at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, on the Fremantle campus, which is a part of Perth. As a poet and fiction writer, Anne-Marie examines topics of embodiment, risk, addiction, and faith. In 2022, she won the Missouri Review Editors Prize in Fiction, and in 2024, she was the writer-in-residence at Bundanon. Her work has appeared in the Georgia Review, A Public Space, Adroit Journal, Palette Poetry, Cordite Poetry Review, and elsewhere. So really welcome to you also, Anne-Marie. So we're looking at poetry in a theoretical sense, but what really excites me tonight is that we're going to have some examples and we have a practitioner in our midst with Anne-Marie as well. So in this webinar, what we're hoping is that we're going to really delve into the way that religion and faith can inform the arts. And there's a particular emphasis, as you would have seen, on poetry today, as we have a practicing poet, Anne-Marie, as well as an expert on the work of Seamus Heaney, Gary Wade. And we also refer to the visual arts by looking at some of the work of David Jones, Dr. Elizabeth Powell. So what I'm going to do, first of all, is to ask each of our participants to begin by sharing a piece of art, poetry, and so it's mainly poetry, but we also have a piece of visual art with everyone here today to kick off the conversation. And I hope that it will be a conversation amongst all of us. And of course, feel free to ask any questions, and Amanda is sending those through to me in the background. So I'm really hoping that this will be an opportunity to share the great richness of these poets. So I'm going to start with you, Gary, if I may.
Thank you,
So
Rennie.
over to you. Thank you.
So thank you, Rennie, and thank you for the sharing the screen. I'll just read it if you don't mind from the Spirit Level, which is the book in which Heaney published it. So a very brief bit of background. St. Kevin was a saint, a monk at Glendalough in the 6th century. Glendalought's in County Wicklow, outside Ireland. And it tells the story of Kevin in his monastic cell. It's a small cell. In order to pray, he must stretch one hand out the window. And as he stretches his hand out, a blackbird lands and lays its eggs in it. So he's now committed to keeping his hand outstretched until the blackbird lays its eggs. So, St. Kevin and the blackbird. And then there was St. Kevin and the blackbird. The saint is kneeling, arms stretched out inside his cell. But the cell is narrow, so one upturned palm is out the window, stiff as a crossbeam. When a blackbird lands and lays in it and settles down to nest. Kevin feels the warm eggs, the small breast, the tucked neat head and claws, and finding himself linked into the network of eternal life, is moved to pity. Now he must hold his hand like a branch out in the sun and rain for weeks, until the young are hatched and fledged and flown. And since the whole thing's imagined anyhow, imagine being Kevin. Which is he, self-forgetful or in agony all the time? From the neck on out down through his hurting forearms, are his fingers sleeping? Does he feel his knees? Or has the shut-eyed blank of under-earth crept up through him? Is there distance in his head? Alone and mirrored clear in love's deep river, to labour and not to seek reward, he prays. A prayer his body makes entirely, for he has forgotten self, forgotten bird, and on the riverbank, forgotten the river's name. So I'll just say a few things, Renee, if that's okay. For me, it's a very, very beautiful, very tender poem. And if I can say something about the connection between faith and poetry, I think for me, the connection is fundamentally love. If we distill the notion of faith, it's love of God and love of neighbor. And in this, you get this sacrifice of Kevin, self-forgetful, with no seeking no reward except the joy and the sacrifice of doing the right thing for this tiny kind of creature, blackbird. And I think Wallace Stevens said that poetry is description is revelation, and I think poetry can be a form of revelation with, if you like, a small r. And here you've got what's revealed is love for the natural world, self-sacrifice and love, and also a form of pure concentration, which I think Anne-Marie, I'm sure, will know this more than most. The poets involved in absolute concentration and attention to the world. And so Heaney, for example, said elsewhere in an essay called The Government of the Tongue, he writes about the moment in John's Gospel in chapter 8 where the woman caught in adultery, Jesus kneels down and writes in the sand. And in that writing in the sand, he creates a space between what's about to happen and a kind of a richer reality of forgiveness. And in a sense, poetry, I think, is that moment of is that space between what might happen and what and the visionary sense of what can happen. So I'll say no more because I don't want to take up any more time on that. But it's one of my favorite poems.
Mm.
Thank you, Renee.
Thank you so much, Gary. And I know that there'll be some comments and questions because you've said a great deal. I can tell you've spent some time with poetry because you're able to turn a phrase in such a way that it could be returned and reveal even more. So thank you
Thank you, Retta.
already. Thanks, Gary. Um, Anne Marie, over to you.
Thank you, Renee. And Gary, that was magnificent. I'd never read that poem before, and I loved the surprise midway through. I was just like, oh my gosh, we're going in this new direction, and it's magnificent, magnificent. So today I'm going to read the work of Kaveh Akbar, a Muslim poet, Iranian American, and a bit of a hero of mine, but that's by the by, but I just thought I'd mention it. I'll read the poem and then I'll give a couple of just short reflections to get us warmed up. I will mention that Akbar is in recovery as an alcoholic, a recovered alcoholic, and that I think is quite pertinent in introduction to this poem, especially considering the faith tradition that he is from. Therein kind of lies the complication. 7 years sober, Kaveh Akbar. Trust God, but tie your camel. Trust God. The bottle by the bed, the first few weeks. Just in case. Trust. After the nights of too relaxed to breathe. After the nights, no repetition, only insistence. Trust. Buying raspberries to watch them rot, dipping bread in water. Trust. You find a gold tooth washed up on the beach, so long in coming. Gurfa, the volume of water that can fit in your hand. Trust God, the volume of your hand, but carry water. So I'm going to give two short reflections on why I find this particular poem so powerful. Part of its power is actually from teaching it. I've taught this poem many times to students, for example, in our sort of core curriculum program who come from all disciplines and sort of, we have hundreds, right? Nurses, physios, teachers, they could be coming from anywhere. And yet this poem speaks so loudly and so clearly to so many of them. They come from different faith communities, many are non-believers, and yet this poem, they really take something away with them. And this repetition of the word trust, it just, the poem is clear, it's concise, it's not cryptic. You can really walk away with this and remember these repetitions throughout your mind. And I've just seen it really touch people. And, just recently I taught 85 high schoolers and we worked through this poem and I just saw them feel such, I think that they were given such strength in recognition of the meaning, but also in what they could sort of take away from the poem. So that's why I think it's beautiful. I think it's understated. I think it's humble. And I think it's an invitation to each of us, right? And this is where I'm going to finish by saying it's been an invitation to me recently. Recently, my beloved cat decided to take a walk into the neighbor's yard and she was attacked by two rescue dogs. And I jumped the fence, saved my cat. Admittedly, she's had a fractured leg she's in recovery. I also got quite injured. And I won't go into the gory details, but what I will say is this poem, it was so interesting. I'd been teaching it just that previous week. And that line of trust God, but tie your camel, just repeated. I ended up in critical care. My cat ended up in critical care. And I just kept reminding myself, when it comes to faith, yes, we must have trust, but yes, we must also act. Trust, act, trust, act. And it really just gave me this simple directive. And that's why it speaks to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne Marie, for sharing that. Yeah, amazing. And I'll be interested to hear more of what the students have taken away from this poem in the core curriculum. And now, Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you, Renee, and thank you so much, Gary and Anne-Marie. Having read your poems beforehand, it sort of inspired me to move towards this image by Jones. I think partly that stream of water that runs through these hills, a very symbolic bridge, I think, across the over the waters and bridging those two hills together. And Gary, there's a little blackbird as well looking for a nest. I think it might be a swallow. I'm not sure, which perhaps has some other meaning there. But this this painting seems, yeah, apt for me as a way to think through the relation of faith and poetry afresh, not least because it was really a time where Jones's own clarity of vocation as an artist and a new convert to Catholicism came into view for him in a new way. So he was painting this in 1925, around the time when he was having long stays in the Black Mountains of Wales, this borderland. As he writes of this period of formation, he says, "At last he was understanding the particular carpentry which most sorted with my inclinations and limitations." Says this vocation here isn't arising from religious doctrine, though he was newly converted to Catholicism a few years before, or from philosophy in the abstract, but this quote, living in Nantes, there to feel the impact of the strong hill rhythms, the bright counter rhythms of the Aveneth Difroith, or the rivers of water. So this poetic vision came into view for him. In other words, by rising from this presence to, in, with, or as a friend of mine says, for a particular place, this concrete, contactual, what the senses register, as he says elsewhere, that enables to recognize and perceive the truth of his own place. So something for me, I think, in cultivating this practice of presence to place with this artwork, that's helped me think through the potential relationship between faith and poetry, and that it traces this movement of descent, kind of submersion, surrendering to the place in which we find ourselves, our own bodies, our neighbors, as Gary was saying as well, the more than human creaturely reality of which we're a part, because it's the same movement of self-giving, maybe that sacrifice, Gary, this kind of forgetting of self, this self-giving to, in, with, or for place, that is God's own movement towards us. It's the way God's self is made known to us. It's this sense of listening deeply to where we find ourselves rather than flying above. Just a note to say, I really appreciated that Anne-Marie, you were saying teaching your poem has brought so many new insights, and I find that just endlessly with Jones's visual work, especially. And so that some of the students have helped me see just how profoundly this intimacy between the divine and or the sacred and place is imaginatively configured in this work. My students have seen in those hills that are kind of cleaving to the side of Christ there, perhaps an evocation of a Mary Magdalene or a Mother Mary, cloaked, robed, bending towards the sacred body. They've even seen in that rib cage a tree, evocation of a tree rooted on a hill, the sternum as a trunk, and the ribs as branching, slowly sloping up and outwards. Of course, Jones was reading at this time The Death of Arthur, a myth, Celtic folktale myth that really identifies the sleeping lord of Arthur with the land. And he weds this together with a sense of the incarnate Christ in place. So I'll just read just part of this, I think, towards starting at do the small black horses. So we've got this lovely, lovely horse here. Do the small black horses grass on the hunch of his shoulders? Are the hills his couch? Or is he the couchant hills? Are the slumbering valleys hymn and slumber? Are the still undulations the still limbs of him sleeping? Is the configuration of the land the furrowed body of the Lord? Are the scarred ridges his dented greaves? Do the trickling gullies yet drain his hog wounds? Does the land wait the sleeping Lord, or is the wasted land that very Lord who sleeps? I think I'll leave that there. It's always a difficult poem to come back to, as it were. But I think, yeah, this amazing sense of rising from this poetry, I think for Jones isn't something that we just make up out of nothing, but poetry is all around us. The poet's work is learning to be present to that and respond to that through their own particular voice. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It strikes me that in each case, the poetry has taken on the kind of tonality and depth of prayer, that there's a deep relationship between the words and somehow God is resounding through the words into the world. Yeah, really, really magnificent poetry that we've heard already tonight. And I know that it's been touching those who are here on the call today, because I already have a question that I might begin with before I go to some of the questions we've discussed before. So what we've been asked is how each of you might summarize your belief in the enduring power of the written word to shape belief, deepen understanding, and illuminate the mystery of the divine. So it's quite a beautiful way to lead in, I think, after we've heard those wonderful poems and your reflections on them. Does any of you have a response to that question before we continue?
Well, I firstly want to say it's an incredible question to open up with. I think it encompasses everything we're trying to answer. And I feel a little meek in attempting to answer such a brilliant question. One simple thing that I will say is that I think poetry especially just kind of begins that attempt, that attempt at poking a little stick at what divinity might be. And I think it comes in so many variations. But the poets who do attempt to speak towards divinity, I think when people reflect with these poems, it often opens up really new ways of seeing. And I think we've just seen that in the last three poems, that each help us see in really beautiful new ways. And I love, Elizabeth, what you said about your students seeing even Mary in that visual, which of course is, the visual arts, but that's my mini attempt.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Gary or Elizabeth, would you like to make a mini attempt as well?
If I could maybe just pick up on what Anne-Marie said, Rennie, that yeah, I think the idea that there's something about the form of poetry which I kind of often think is porous, in the sense that it's open-ended. There's a kind of a closure to prose in poetry. As Anne-Marie said, you're gesturing towards something, or moving towards something, and it's never quite closed. And that's the idea, I suppose, for the believer of mystery, and the idea of God who cannot be known completely. So I think, yeah, I think it puts shape on something kind of inchoate within ourselves. That our emotional life, or our fears, or our just our faith journey, poetry shapes it in some way, but not doesn't enclose it, leaves it porous and open, to God, or to the transcendent.
Thanks, Gary. Elizabeth, did you want to comment at all?
Yeah, no, I loved, but both of you said so much, and Gary, just that saying poetry, this helps us find a shape on something inchoate in ourselves is so wonderful. Yeah, and I think there's this sense of reading poetry actively, writing poetry. There's this sense of um, I guess, kind of being taken out of oneself as well, like being attentive to what's before one, which is why just the material of even the words, this word fits with this one, or it creates dissonance, or, it's this constant moving ourselves in relation to that which is outside of us, then finding those echoes in ourself as well. That, yeah, I think this kind of, Anne Marie, what you were saying as well, this, in a way, it's kind of a form of risk taking, isn't it? To enter into the possibility of revelation yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and poetry in all the poems that you have brought to us tonight, I think that there is a dealing with both the beauty and the harshness of reality. So it's not as though it's glossing over what we find, which can be quite difficult as humans dealing with an incarnate world, finding what's beautiful there, but at the same time, the resonating work of the poem touches something within us. I always think that a good poem kind of hurts. It's almost like we've been pierced in a way by reality, and that's when the poem is actually doing its work in us. So we might come back to what it might feel like to write a poem as well, because I've never succeeded in anything like that. So that kind of poetic action, and you would know through David Jones's work, Elizabeth, and Gary through Seamus Heaney's work, and Anne Marie, of course, your own work, what that kind of activity is and how it could even be thought of as a kind of prayer, but also a grappling with what God has given us in this rather difficult world that we live in. And I know that each of the poems, the poets you've brought to us have been dealing with really difficult things, and yet they've created, and maybe not yet, but because of this, they've brought us something beautiful and rich and almost gritty and powerful. I wanted to ask you though, so one of the themes tonight is of course about the Catholic imagination, and this of course brings us to the way that Christ matters to art. And so I wanted to delve into that with you, or ask you if you could take us into that place to ask you, how do you think the Christian artist sees the world, perhaps differently from those who come from another faith tradition or no faith at all? So what difference does Christ make to an artwork? What difference does Christ make to poetry?
Shall I jump in and start, Rennie?
Go for it,
Uh,
Gary.
um, I think it's interesting what you said, Rennie, earlier about the hurt, and it was. I mean, I hadn't intended to say this, but when I looked at Elizabeth's the painting by David Jones of the crucifixion, it's very hard to see that now without making a connection with the kind of multiple pain and crucifixions that we see every day now on the news. And so it makes me think about I suppose, yeah, what is poetry for? I mean, how do we address that without turning it into pure aesthetics, if you like, for our own kind of pleasure? And I think the answer to your question, Renee, about how the Christian artist sees the world, um, I mean, I think as deeply sacramental or incarnational, um, that every single thing, to borrow Blake's image, the grain of sand is of infinite value. Um, and there's a beautiful poem by Czeslaw Miłosz, who was a great influence on Heaney. He met him in Harvard in the 80s, and Heaney Miłosz has a poem called "The Blacksmith Shop," and he says, and it's a very powerful line. He says, uh, "I stare and stare. It seems I was called for this, to glorify things just because they are." So that idea of the richness of being, and when I talk about being, I mean not just, I mean Anne-Marie very beautifully shared about um, what happened to you, Anne-Marie, and your cat. I mean, this
Yeah.
is the pain that's shared there between, if you want to call it, animal life and human life. I mean, and that that incarnationally, the world is immense. Every detail of the world is immensely rich. Um, I think that's fundamentally what a Christian, how a Christian artist sees the world. And you get it in later in Heaney, where he in a collection called District and Circle, and published in 2006, so quite late. I mean, he's talking there about farmyard implements having a kind of a life. He imagines a
Mm.
pitchfork flying off into the air. So that you've got this visionary quality, which is terrifically rich. Um, and it's a shift from his earlier poetry, which is focused on farm life and animals and friendships and so on and family. But you think of a pitchfork having a value and a kind of a life of its own, I think is terrific. And I think that's very much the incarnational view of the world.
Thanks, Gary. I'm reminded of, I think it's Gerard Manley Hopkins in one of his diary entries says, the more you look at something, the more it starts to look back at you. So
Yeah,
there's this
yeah, yeah. Beautiful. Yeah,
relationship with the world. Yeah. So even a seemingly inanimate object takes on some kind of value that
yeah.
if you don't attend to it, would
Uh-huh.
be lost in some way. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you, Rennie.
Elizabeth or Anne Marie, would you like to comment at all?
Yeah, as Gary was chatting, I was thinking very much about, to me, I think as a writer who is Catholic, I think a really foundational influence to me has been Flannery O'Connor's Mystery and Manners. I know that many people here in our room, I'm sure are writers. I'm sure that many of you write, and I found her essays, she's so sassy, and I just found her essays so inspiring because she freed me of this feeling that I couldn't write the world as it is. Because when I look out at the world,
Mm.
what I see is really hectic. And I think sometimes when we are Christian Catholic believers, we feel a little guilty writing the world how it is because the world is wild. We see things that we can't make sense of. We see things that are agonizing. We see things that we hate. And I mean that word, I mean in terms of the really evil, the evil that occurs. But Flannery gave me this sort of freedom to, as she expresses, this is the world, like this is the world as God has presented it. And until God makes a change, we as an artist are called to actually represent, to actually display it. We don't need to make, it's not our job to kind of judge, to make all the values. Of course we do to an extent, right? But our job is simply to paint, paint with words, paint what we see, and leave the rest up to God. And I found that very freeing. I was like, thank you, Flannery O'Connor, all of that wisdom. And I think she died at the age of 43. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you, Anne Marie.
Yeah.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, it was so wonderful hearing that testimony, Anne Marie, really the poets work as giving testimony, testifying, saying, what is, this is. And I think for Jones, there is the sense of being able to say, what is always fundamentally on some level an act of praise for him, like some form of saying, speaking truth, goodness, beauty in the midst of brokenness. And yeah, maybe learning the wisdom of the name Emmanuel, God with us. Yeah. But yeah, and I love that you use the word wild. It's one of those words that yeah refuses to be domesticated, and I think the kind of poetry that you're speaking of um, as this kind of testimony or witness to what is really is so precious because it breaks down our attempts to domesticate Christ, or our images of God that become very well overly tended, I suppose, or overly ordered, and yeah, the world is itself kind of trying to tell us maybe something different about the divine as well, even in the midst of that. horror, really.
Elizabeth, can I add? I feel when you, and I'm sure many of us have had this experience of seeing an artist attempt to paint God or speak God into a work, and where it doesn't feel quite right. There seems to be some sort of insincerity or some sort of attempt, but it doesn't feel authentic. And I think the best art that attempts to engage divinity in some way, if it needn't, but in the event that it does, I think there needs to be a kind of an authenticity. How you find that, I don't know that I have the answer, but I think we know it. We know it when we know it when we see it. I really felt that way, Gary, in the poem that you read, where there's an authenticity where these really curious, unique questions start coming in. You just are like, yes, this is speaking the language of trying to understand divinity.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's, I was just going to add to that, this kind of refusal towards closure, I suppose. Like a willingness to, yeah, I think with Jones, when he's at his best, it's this sense of capacity to keep asking the question, essentially, like to live in the cleft. Yeah.
And that brings us back, I think, to the porosity that Gary was speaking about earlier as well. That poetry is porous to the world, and we become more porous perhaps as we're engaging with the poetry ourselves. You've raised, so just with that whole issue of authenticity, if I can go in that direction now, maybe Elizabeth, by asking you, so David Jones, we've talked about this at an earlier point outside of this webinar, but he seems to have struggled with the way that religion operates in, or doesn't operate in modern society, and also with hope and with despair. And what I'm wondering is if you could comment more on how his work might inform the way that you understand the role of art today. So
Yeah.
how is it, and even to take it back to that point of authenticity, how do we identify an authentic work of art in this hectic world that Anne-Marie was describing?
Yeah. Big questions. Yeah, I almost want to say that the only right answer is I don't know.
But keep asking, right? That's where the authentic poetry
That's
begins.
right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think for, Jones, his struggles were so much with feeling like, I mean, Gary used that word revelation with a lowercase r. He felt that
Mm,
one of his kind of taglines is that sacrament with the lowercase s is disappearing from modern culture. It's being replaced with efficiency and instrumentalization, this kind of ways of controlling and managing what's around us. Um, and he saw that. I think he would say that is an inauthentic way of being human
mm,
in the world. So yeah, that kind of there's got to be something in a work of art, I think, where it has the trace of love of
mm,
the artists themselves, and that is something that speaks to the heart, that can't necessarily be boiled down by uh, um, it can't be quantified or even necessarily identified. But that we know it, kind of what you were saying before, we know it when we see it. But yeah, I think this profound sense of, no matter how deep his own despair was, he was in World War I, so had profound trauma to deal with, to live with, really, his whole life. And rather than run from that, I think there was, or to give up entirely, I think his faith gave him a capacity not to not be fully afraid of that space, to not avoid it, but to know that um, um, that ultimately it didn't rest on his own might or
yeah.
his own will to keep the world ordered. There's the sense of constantly poetry and visual arts were a way of getting back in touch with the real, with what
Mm,
is, and to let that to let himself be a part of that, is itself this kind of healing process potentially, which I think he did find.
Yeah, so that it becomes a source of revelation in one's own life in the way that you're describing it. Thank you, Elizabeth. Anne Marie, I wonder if I could ask you as our resident poet, as it were, on the webinar, could I ask you about how you work as a poet? I suppose maybe you could draw on the way that other poets work as well, and where poetry might lead us in the contemporary world. So you've given us some hints, but I'm wondering if you could just go into it a little bit more. Is there something you could tease out about that point of how is it that a poetry goes about making a poem?
Yeah, I love talking about practice. I could probably be such a bore. I could sit here for the next 3 hours and talk about practice, but I'll keep it short. But
Give us your 3-minute take on it. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So I'm sure many of you here write. I'm sure many of you may very likely be poets. So I know I'm not speaking to people who are probably wholly unfamiliar with the process, but to me, a poem is it's very neat. I write fiction as well. And fiction, people they need to open the door, they need to walk into a room, they need to get situated. Not a poem, not a poem. You want to just boom. You just want to dive right in there. And there's this beauty of it sort of being this immaculate, if you will, kind of moment, that it's just this fast, hot, whatever you want to call it, but it's this moment. And to me, as a writer and a writer of faith, what I have found, I think, is actually a courage to go into whatever space that may be. Now, that may be a space of hopefulness, or it may not. It may be a space of disquiet, it may be a space of anger, it may be a space of anything. And I think what is magnificent about the act of going into that space is that we show up. That's all you really have to do. Maybe the poem will work, maybe the poem radically won't work. It doesn't really matter. And I think just the act of showing up and attempting to use the words, the form, the restrictions that you give yourself. I often do find, and I'm going to bring it back to Aristotle here. I do find there is catharsis. I truly find that poetry offers us this opportunity to cathartically go into that's one, that one shot in history, whatever it might be, to attempt to go there. Sometimes I change the paper. I know that sounds a bit odd, but if I work on butcher's paper, the poem comes out really differently. If I work on a small paper, it comes out really differently. So I think changing what you use, do you use a pencil? Do you use a pen? Are you outside or you're inside? Like changing up the context will actually inspire a really different engagement with that scene that you attempt to grapple with.
And that's so fascinating because it points again to the way that the poet is embedded in the world and is drawing from the situation in which she or he finds themselves.
Yeah,
I
but
think
you get to do this magnificent thing of also taking such disparate, often such vignettes and weaving. But fiction's a little different, you have to sort of hold together this chronology, this narrative. In poetry, you get to sort of be planted in one space whilst also 99 at the same time. And white space too, very important.
You have to love the blank page.
Yeah.
You've actually touched upon a little bit earlier something that one of our participants here tonight has asked in the background, which is this: do you think, and I might ask all of you this if you want to weigh in, knowing what you know of poetry, does doubt produce greater art than faith?
It can. I think it
Depends on the artist, does it?
It depends on the artist. But I don't say that. I don't say that kitschly.
Yeah.
I actually think in each of the poems we saw both doubt and faith, you know? And I sometimes I think my response would actually be to really contend with both. I think, in each work, having an openness to that which you doubt, having an openness to that which you have faith in, because it's such a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what the kind of language that you're using makes me think that the poet is wrestling with God at his or her best.
Yeah.
In that kind of biblical sense of really like grappling with something that you don't quite understanding, and there's a kind of self-making going on at the same time. One of my sons was absolutely fascinated with that passage in the Bible. He must have heard it at school, and he came home one day and said, "Did you know that this guy wrestled with God? How did that work, Mum?" But that's the sort of essence of it. We have to open up that wondering space as well in order to get into poetry. Gary, you looked like you wanted to weigh in on this one as
Oh, I
Oh,
was just going to add to what Anne-Marie said, Renee, that if you think of someone like St. John of the Cross, I mean, in a sense, this saintly figure, but it's a great, his poetry is a great poetry of darkness. And,
Yeah.
I suppose more recently, someone like R.S. Thomas, this again, priestly figure whose poetry is shot through with doubt and absence. And so, yeah, I think it's an excellent question. And I think, yeah, we can't be too smug about faith. I mean, it's a kind of a well, it's double-edged. It's and doubt in a sense, I think teaches us humility and draws us maybe. I mean, I think that's what John of the Cross is talking about. Draws us deeper into a relation, a searching for God.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most that you probably know, one of the most beautiful translations is actually Heaney's translation of of John of the Cross in Station Island, and it mirrors Heaney's own doubts and wrestling with his childhood faith.
Mm.
So I think it's a great question, really.
Yeah, it is a great question. And it takes us back to something that you've all touched on in some way, which is that poetry is really energized by love, by exploring love, and arguably doubt and faith could both be expressions of love and of searching for some kind of meaning. Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you, no, I've already asked you this. Sorry, I'm getting lost in my notes here because the conversation is so rich. Gary, it's your turn.
Uh-huh.
Do you think that in the end, Heaney, and this is a point about faith as well, Heaney thought that faith is important to being a poet, or is it rather that he captured, and this goes back to a comment you just made, I think, the echoes of faith and used them in his poetry? So I think there's a bit of an argument about whether Heaney was a dyed-in-the-wool believer at the end,
Mhm.
or whether he had lost his faith somewhere along the way and was always trying to
Uh-huh.
capture something that
Yeah.
maybe he couldn't ever capture again. So over to you. You'll know better
Okay.
than I do what it is that I'm trying to ask, I think.
Uh-huh. No, it's again, Renee, it's a great question. I think your phrase is beautiful. Echoes of faith. Um, I mean, I've always been reluctant to kind of try and tie Heaney down. I mean, he says himself in Stepping Stones, which is a series of interviews in 2008, that he no longer believed in that, if you like, propositional sense, if you want to call it that, the creedal sense. Um, but I mentioned Czesław Miłosz earlier. When he died in 2004, Heaney attended his funeral in Poland and then wrote a magnificent poem called Out of This World. And the first part of that poem's a sonnet, um, and it's published in District and Circle. And Heaney talks about watching people receiving the host and coming back to their seats and kneeling down. And he says, and I think it's magnificent, and it sums up Heaney. I hope it answers your question, really. He says the loss occurred off stage. So, whether that's his own faith, I mean, it's always, you can't always make a biographical connection, but I think in this case, it's fair enough. So he says the loss occurred off stage, and yet I cannot disavow words like thanksgiving, host, and communion bread. They have an undying tremor and draw. like well water far down. So it's this powerful image of
Yeah.
the depth. And I suppose they've humanized that in some way, Rennie. Last week I went back to some columns where Heaney boarded and where I was a day boy. Not at the same time, but uh, to to give a talk. And when I was there, I had visitors came over from England, and I took them to see the college chapel where Heaney was served mass, and where the room next to the college chapel up at the gallery is called it was the sick bay. So if a pupil was sick, they stayed there and they could still attend mass by coming into the gallery and watching mass. And it's there that Heaney was told by the college president that his 4-year-old brother had been knocked down and killed. And he
Mm.
then spent time in the chapel waiting for a neighbor to come and pick him up. Um, and I remember being there as a pupil, and I had a sister who was diagnosed with cancer when she was young, and she survived, thankfully. But I remember that emotional pull of the chapel and the candles and
Mm.
the stained glass and all that. And so when I was there last week, I mean that kind of welled up on me again. And
Mm.
I think that maybe describes Heaney. Heaney feels, I talk about in the book on Heaney and Catholicism about Catholicism as a felt sense.
Mm.
Heaney feels it. Um, and therefore, questions of belief, propositional belief, and so on, at some level, I mean, of course, they're interesting, but I think he was he was deeply Catholic in his sensibility, um, and at the level at the real level of feeling. I don't know if that answers the question or
Yeah.
complicates it, but
Well, complications are good, right?
uh-huh,
Because I think we are in a complicated on a complicated terrain here,
yeah,
sort of looking at that space between belief and feeling.
uh-huh, uh-huh,
And I suppose that the question is, so if I were to put it philosophically, my question would be, is feeling enough to have that really rooted sense in Christ and in the propositions that
uh-huh,
Christ leaves us with. Um,
yeah,
and I think that's what I find really interesting about Heaney, sort of asking myself, well, what did it mean for him? What might it mean for us as well?
yeah,
What are the dangers of falling into an aestheticism?
yeah. I think Renee, I think it can take you so far. And it was lovely to hear Anne Marie talk about the idea how poetry is a kind of almost it comes in an instant, if you like, rather than Heaney had a beautiful image. He said poetry carries truth alive into the heart. So it's this that's I suppose at the level of some kind of um, at our effective at an effective level or an emotional level. But yes, I don't think it's how we then proceed in relation to kind of creedal, if you want to call it that, creedal belief and so on. So I don't think it's the finished product. But then as Elizabeth and Amory, you've been saying, poetry in that sense is never the finished. It's porous, and it opens up a world that then we must respond to,
Mm. Yeah.
or at least we're invited. Anne-Marie used the word invitation earlier. Yeah, it's an invitation,
Yeah.
not a dogma, if you like.
Yeah. And Brian, who's on the call, asks whether we're talking about dyed-in-the-wool non-believing but cultural Catholicism. So I suppose that question of cultural Catholicism is arising here
Yeah,
and what that means.
yeah. I would, yeah, I would want to say that for Heaney, it's more than cultural Catholicism.
Mm.
Um, that, yeah, that he, I mean, he talks even in his prose, he talks constantly in sacramental language,
Mm.
um, and up until the end, um, uh, and yeah, I mean, it's very he'd a requiem mass, which I assume was Heaney's wish, and I think I think just going back to the belief and doubt thing, it's so. I suppose we live in a world where we're so polarized. We kind of think that it's either this or that, and I think uh, I think Heaney believed, and again, to use with a small b, believed in the sacramental nature of reality. Um, but somewhere along the line wasn't what we might call a practicing Catholic, to use that word, which
Yeah.
is limiting in some ways also. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and we could probably keep talking about this. In fact, we have on other occasions, Gary, so we
Yeah.
won't
No, thank you, Rennie.
we won't continue. Exactly. I want to ask a final question before I hand back to Amanda to tell us about some of the wonderful th other things coming up in the tablet. And that is a question that has again come from the floor. So how, in the experience of the panel, does AI impact modern day poetry? Or interestingly, this relates to something that I had thought about earlier as well, which is this. So, what difference should Christ make to the work of the poet in a world that emphasizes profit and efficiency, and which claims that an artificial intelligence can create works of art? So, I know that there are lots of issues with, apparently I could pop it into some form of chat GPT to please make me, a depiction of Donald Trump in the style of Caravaggio, and it would come up with something. Is that art? I don't know. Probably not, is my guess. But if I went into poetry, because that's what we've been dealing with the most, even though we've had this wonderful this wonderful moment with David Jones's piece of visual art, which I'm going to keep coming back to, I think, Elizabeth. Why is it that, let me put this to you, I don't think that an artificial intelligence can ever be a poet. Am I right or am I wrong?
Heavens, I hope you're right. I hope you're right. To me, what is so unique about poetry is how utterly disruptive it is. It's so surprising, it's so personal, it's so unique, it can be so disjointed, it's so everything that is explosive. And to me, that's not a robotic learned behavior of, AI, right? But let's be real, in 20 years, everything's gonna disagree with me. So I can't stop the trend, but my goodness, if poems aren't written by humans grappling, I'm out.
Yeah, and embodied humans grappling in place,
Hmm.
for place, as Elizabeth was saying as well, Yeah.
Could I
What do you
add?
think, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I love this question. It's just made me think of I think if AI becomes a genuine poet, then it will no longer be artificial. But in
Mm.
building these machines,
Oh.
we might risk becoming artificial ourselves.
Aha!
Well
Nice
done.
twist.
Well
That was
done.
great. Thanks, Elizabeth. Gary, last one to you, and then we'll hand back to Amanda.
Yeah, no, I think both what Elizabeth and Anne-Marie said is absolutely right. I often think of that line, I can't remember which book, from C.S. Lewis, man's final conquest will be the abolition of man,
Mm.
and yeah, I worry about AI in that sense. I mean, I think that the very the very definition should be worrying. It's artificial, and it's intelligence, which only speaks to one aspect of who we are as human beings. So it's not
Mm.
wholesome. And again, if we go back to the very start, where do you fit love into that? Thanks,
Thank
Rennie.
you, Gary. Back to love again. So we
Well
might leave
said.
on that beautiful note. I extend my thanks to all three panelists. This has been amazing, and I thank you very much indeed. Amanda, over to you.
Well, thanks very much. It's sort of hanging on your every word. And I think AI, as our editor says, Brendan Walsh says, you can always tell when something's written by AI because it's frictionless. And, and that's an interesting way to look at it. But thank you so much. Thank you to Renee and the University of Notre Dame, Australia, and Gary, Elizabeth, and Anne-Marie. It's been really wonderful working with you on this project. As we look forward, see what's coming up with the tablet. If you wanted a recording of this, there is quite a lot to unpack in this webinar this evening or this morning or wherever you are. Then please do just drop me a line and we'll be happy to send out the recording to you. It's not a problem at all. And as we move forward, we have We always do around about this time a series of webinars which look at things like human trafficking. We're addressing domestic abuse in church communities. They're tough topics, but we do cover them, and we're never fearful of covering topics like this at the tablet. So if you wanted to support that event with Stephanie McGillivray and Nikki Dillon-Keane, it's on Tuesday, the 8th of July, 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. We'll be talking about domestic abuse and how it affects communities, including those in faith, and how our churches can help and support people with safety, healing, and a safe environment. So that's on the 8th of July. We've also got Faith Beyond Resentment, reimagining Catholicism from inside out. This is not going to be a usual debate. It's not about gay theology. It's a bold rethink of Catholic faith itself. And we have our theologian and priest, James Allison, for an evening of fresh, fearless insight into a Christianity rooted in tradition but freed from outdated narratives. He was educated by both the Dominicans and the Jesuits. He's a former novice, and he's one of the most original voices in theology today. So you can hear his take on reimagining Catholicism on Wednesday, the 9th of July, 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. Please don't forget, we have this amazing one-day conference lined up, Leadership and Legacy, the Future of Women in the Church. It's sponsored by CCLA, and we're in partnership with New Hall School in Chelmsford. So it's a keynote speaker is Lucy Winkett. We've got workshop panels, and we've got If the Sun's Shining, which I hope it is, activities on the lawn. It's based at New Hall Boreham House. Think Jane Austen, and you'll not be far away from that. And you get to meet all the tablet team and just spend a wonderful day together in debate. So please have a look at the tickets for that. And part of the special offer is that you also get a quarterly digital subscription to the tablet. So all the details of that and how to purchase the ticket are on our website. And then we've got a theory and practice session on Augustinian spirituality with Father George Donoghue of Clare Priory. So one evening, which is the Wednesday the 30th, we'll be talking about the theory, and then we'll be practicing and experiencing Augustinian contemplation. So I'm really looking forward to that. If you're still looking for pilgrimages, we have the Roman Assisi in October, and we've got the pilgrimage to Paris in September, and the coverage of all of the historical 5 weeks from the passing of Pope Francis to the introduction of Pope Leo can all be seen on the tablet archive. And if you're not a subscriber to the Pastoral Review of the Tablet, just go to www.thetablet.co.uk. It's our 185th anniversary. And you can have a look at the archive through our digital offering. So on behalf of myself and the rest of the tablet team that bring these webinars to you, we'd just like to thank you so much for joining us. Thank you once again to our guests and our partner, Notre Dame University, Australia. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Good evening.
Thank you so much. Good
Thank you,
evening.
Amanda.
Good morning. See you. Bye.